Welcome back to day 4 of the science behind the farm. And today we're looking at the wildlife and biodiversity that we find here at Jubilee Farm. Not just wild animals, but also wild plants. Farms and the billion farmers around the world are important custodians of nature. And here at Jubilee Farm, we take our environmental stewardship as seriously as our agricultural stewardship. We have, for example, this little bit of brae, which we call in County Antrim. It's really a steep hillside full of scrub and in some places woodland. But we also have hundreds and hundreds of metres of hedgerow of various ages and stages. And while Northern Ireland may be the least wooded part of the least wooded country in Europe, we are really fortunate to have an abundance of hedgerows. Our hedgerows are really the forests in our fields, important corridors for wildlife, bursting with life, food sources in winter, and full of all sorts of incredible species. What you can see here in our nature reserve, or the brae here, is nature going through a process of what is called succession. Ecosystems want to eventually become forests, and whereas this was grazed perhaps 30 or 40 years ago, it's gradually reverting to scrub. You can see different scrubby plants coming through, lots of brambles, lots of gorse, small trees starting to emerge, and eventually they want to succeed to become woodland. It's also a place where some plants that we don't really want in our fields, we allow them to flourish here, and that includes the likes of ragwort here. Ragwort is poisonous to farm animals if they consume it, so we make sure if we ever find it in our fields to remove it. But ragwort is also a really important food source for the cinnabar moth, and so we allow it to flourish down here in our nature reserve, because one species weed is another species food source. As well as all the native plants that we want to encourage, we can see here in our nature reserve 2 unwelcome visitors. The first of these is an invasive species called Himalayan honeysuckle. And like a lot of other invasive species like Himalayan balsam or the dreaded Japanese knotweed that you may have heard of, they originally came into the country through the activities of Victorian plant collectors back in the 19th century, when there was a craze for going to Asia in particular and collecting lots of exotic plants. The problem when they escape from gardens and get into places like this is that they tend to outcompete our native plants and can swamp areas of land and hillside, as the Himalayan honeysuckle is threatening to do here. So every so often with our volunteers, our conservation volunteers here at Jubilee Farm, we have to manage that and cut it back, allowing our native plants to flourish in its place. The other unwelcome visitor that we have here on the farm is something called ash dieback. Ash are our most common tree in Northern Ireland, or certainly one of our most common tree species, and on our farm they're the most common tree species. On the woodland behind me, which is Glenwood ASSI, or Area of Special Scientific Interest, they're also the most common tree species. And for the last decade or so, a disease called ash dieback has spread from Europe all the way across Europe into Britain and Ireland, and is causing major problems with our ash trees, causing them literally over time to die. And that just shows that epidemics and pandemics are not just common to people, but they can also spread among plants. And so as we seek to manage this area of scrub and woodland for nature and also for people, and as we think about some innovative reforestation techniques, for example using pigs to clear some of the scrub, which is what we plan to do, we'll be thinking about future-proofing it by planting non-ash species so that it continues to flourish well into the future. As well as a diversity of plant life at Jubilee Farm, we also have a fantastic diversity of wild animals. All sorts of different species, from buzzards nesting to owls flying at night time through to bats roosting. And as we've started to manage the farm in a way that works for people and works for wildlife, we've started to see some really interesting trends. For example, our pigs, whenever they're rooting in the fields, they often have magpies, crows and the odd egret waiting for the pigs to unearth worms that the birds then swoop in and catch. So it's interesting, wildlife adapting to the activity of our farming here at Jubilee Farm. But right down here in the Bray, or our nature reserve, is where it's most biodiverse because there's least human activity. And here we have herons fishing in the river. But in particular, what interests me as a carnivore conservationist, that's the order of carnivores, meat-eating animals with pointy teeth. We have what's called a guild of carnivores. Now, we often associate guilds or groups of carnivores, things like lions and hyenas and leopards in the Serengeti, or mountain lions, bears and wolves in North America. But right here in Northern Ireland, right here in this little section of a County Antrim farm, we have a carnivore guild in action, because we have otters, foxes and badgers all living and sharing space and habitat here at Jubilee Farm. And what's really interesting is when you have different carnivore species coexisting alongside each other, something happens that is called resource partitioning. And what resource partitioning means is that these similar sized carnivores avoid competing with each other by having different strategies and ways for finding food. So the otters, for example, they hunt in the rivers. They're looking for fish, catching fish and other things that they can find in the water of the Glyn River. The badger is something called semi-fossorial. That means they spend some of their time underground. They live in sets, but they also have these really powerful claws that they can use for digging. So they're digging for earthworms, they're digging for grubs, they're digging for roots. They're almost more omnivorous than carnivorous. And then lastly, we have the fox, which is more of an active hunter, but also a scavenger, and occasionally launching raiding parties up the hill, most recently stealing one of our geese. So it's a really interesting look at the science behind the wildlife of Jubilee Farm, some of the amazing animals and the ways that they have adapted to live here, and also of our responsibility to make sure that we all farm in a way that allows wildlife to flourish alongside people.